sound sa akin. Check, check, check. Check, check, check. Okay.
Dasalin po natin ang Oratio Imperata para sa kapayapaan. Sa ngalan ng Ama, ng Anak, ng Espiritu Santo. Diyos na aming Ama sa langit, Panginoon at ng kapayapaan at katarungan, mapagkumbabang lumalapit kami sa iyo sa panahong ito na tumitinding tensyon sa politika sa aming bahagi ng mundo. Sa nakalipas sa mga taon, pinanatili mo ang aming pananampalataya sa iyo bilang isang bayan. Ang pananalig namin sa iyong kagandahang loob ang siyang nagligtas sa amin sa napakaraming kalamidad na dulot ng kalikasan. Gayun din na mga dahil sa kagagawan ng mga tao na dumagok sa aming kasaysayan. Iligtas mo po kami mula sa lagim ng tigmaan. Digin mo ang aming pagsusumamo. Kahabagan mo kami, Panginoon. Ipagsanggalang kami sa puwersa ng kasamaang nag-uudyok sa mga pinuno ng mundo. Naniniwala kami na hindi kami nakikipaglaban sa mga tao, kundi sa mga pinuno, sa mga may kapangyarihan, sa mga tagapamahala ng kadilimang umiiral sa sanlibutan ito, sa mga hukbong espiritual na kasamaan sa himpapawid. Pinapanalangin namin ang mga pinuno na pinagkakatiwalaang gumawa ng mga pagpasya para sa aming bansa. Buong puso naming pinagkakatiwala sa iyo ang aming kinabukasan at humihingi kami ng kapatawaran at habag sa mga panahon na dahil sa aming mga takot at hinala ay nadungisan na aming mga pananaw at nagdulot ng maling pagkiling at puot laban sa ibang katutubo at lahi. Taimtim kaming nagsusumamo na gawin mo kaming mga daan na iyong kapayapaan. Kung saan may pagpakapuot, ay magdala kami ng pagmamahal. Kung saan may pinsala, kapatawaran. Kung saan may pagdududa, pananampalataya. Kung saan wala na inaasahan, pag-asa. Kung saan may kadiliman, liwanag. Kung saan may kalungkutan, kagalakan. Ito'y aming hiling sa pamamagitan ng aming Panginoong Hesukristo na iyong anak na nabubuhay at naghaharing kasama mo, kasama ng Espiritu Santo, Diyos magpasawalang hanggan. Amen. Mahal na Birhen ng Fatima, aming mahal na ina at reyna ng kapayapaan, ipanalangin mo kami. San Miguel at Arcangel, ipanalangin mo kami. San Jose, ipanalangin mo kami. San Francisco ng Assisi, ipanalangin mo kami. San Lorenzo Ruiz, ipanalangin mo kami. San Pedro Calungsod, ipanalangin mo kami. San Francisco at Santa Jacinta Marto ng Fatima, ipanalangin mo kami. San Ignacio de Loyola, ipanalangin mo kami. Sa ngalan ng Ama, ng Anak, ng Espiritu Santo. Amen.
Good morning again, everyone. My name is Maita Chan Gonzaga of Ateneo Law, and I will be your moderator for this morning. So we are very happy to welcome all of you to this year's JVO Lecture. This event is co-organized by the Jaime Viongpin Center for Business and Government, the Ateneo School of Government, and the Office of University Development and Alumni Affairs. The JVO Annual Memorial Lecture was inaugurated in 2001 to help raise awareness of the Filipino people about pressing national development issues in order to empower them to actively engage in nation building. Delivered by business leaders, senior government officials, and leading academics, the lectures tackle critically important themes in the nexus of democracy and development, including climate change, corruption, education, federalism, globalization, health inequity, poverty, leadership. Aimed to keep alive the spirit with which Jaime Viongpin lived his life, the willingness to risk comfort and safety, wealth and personal security for the sake of freedom and democracy, and thus the greater good of our people and country. The lecture series thus hopes to bring together business and government leaders and Filipinos from every walk of life in a continuing national conversation on the present situation and the future direction of the country. Now on its 23rd year, the lecture will delve into PhilHealth's cash sweep, which highlights the Department of Finance's initiative to reclaim idle and excess funds from government-owned and controlled corporations as mandated by Republic Act number 11975 or the GAA of 2024. The DOF received legal backing affirming that PhilHealth's unutilized government subsidies are not reserve funds, thus available for the national government. The programs and projects funded by the unused government subsidies to PhilHealth include, among others, the health workers' unpaid allowances from the pandemic, salary standardization 6 for government employees, AFP modernization program. This discussion aims to shed light on the broader aspects of these financial maneuvers on national health and development initiatives. We would like to acknowledge, of course, the presence of everyone here today, as well as particularly the Ongpin family and the administrators of the Ateneo de Manila University. We would also like to greet our online audience, alumni and friends who are tuning in today via the live stream on the Ateneo's YouTube channel. So before we proceed to today's discussion, may I invite Father Roberto C. Yap of the Society of Jesus, President of the Ateneo de Manila University, to deliver the welcome remarks.
On behalf of Ateneo de Manila University, I welcome you to the 23rd Jaime V. Ongpin Annual Memorial Lecture in Public Service and Government. Since its inception in 2001, the lecture has helped galvanize Filipinos' attention on critical issues concerning national development. Delivered by business leaders, senior government officials, and leading academics, the lecture tackled various topics from federalism, charter change, and health inequity in poverty, our country's education, and maritime territorial issues. I also had the honor and pleasure of giving a lecture on climate change many moons ago. The annual lecture has been and continues to be a fitting way to honor JVO's contribution to our country. Throughout his life, Jaime V. Ongpin fought for democracy, truth, and justice. He was without question committed to his beloved country, helping advance the common good, working for the betterment of the Filipino people. Today's lecture is critical and timely as it concerns the health and well-being of Filipinos. The Department of Finance's order to return the unused 89.9 billion pesos funds of the Philippine Health Insurance Corporation, or PhilHealth, to the National Treasury was met with mixed reactions, and rightly so. After all, PhilHealth is the agency mandated to provide universal health care for all Filipinos. So tapping the unused funds to finance projects under the unprogrammed appropriations when it could be used to help Filipinos who do not have access to basic health services gives rise to more questions than answers. We are grateful to our speaker, Ms. Saiza Nadine Sosara, Ateneo's AB Development Studies 2005, for sharing her knowledge on this issue. Understanding PhilHealth's cash sweep concerns not just PhilHealth members but every Filipino citizen. The insights we gain from this lecture will inform our understanding and inspire us to take action and continue engaging in conversations that matter to us. Likewise, we extend our gratitude to our panel of reactors and the various offices they have worked with tirelessly to organize this lecture. Your dedication and hard work have made this event possible. We also sincerely thank Mrs. Maria Isabel Ongpin, whose magnanimity has helped Ateneo foster learning, empower our students, and make a meaningful contribution to our society, just like JVO did in his life. Thank you for joining us in today's lecture, and I wish you all a good morning.
Thank you, Father Bobby. May I now request Dr. Randy Tuanyo, Dean of the Ateneo School of Government, to introduce our keynote speaker.
For today's lecture on PhilHealth's cash sweep, a glimpse into the larger problems, I am pleased to introduce our distinguished speakers and reactors who bring invaluable perspectives in governance, public policy, and economics. Our keynote speaker, Ms. Aiza Nadine Suzara, is a respected public budget analyst and advocate for good governance. She has extensive experience in government, international development, and civil society. As the former Executive Director of the Institute of Leadership, Empowerment, and Democracy, or ILEAD, and lead convener of the People's Budget Coalition, Ms. Suzara has been a prominent voice on issues related to fiscal transparency and government accountability. Her work with the Department of Budget and Management, the Department of Trade and Industry, and international organizations like the USAID, the Asia Foundation, the United Nations Development Program, and the World Bank makes her an influential resource on the national budgeting and financial reforms. She has also been a technical consultant on many of the research projects, including those related to public finance and tobacco governance at the Ateneo School of Government. The panel of reactors includes Dr. Cielo Magno, an associate professor at the UP School of Economics and a former undersecretary of the Department of Finance. Dr. Magno brings over 25 years of experience in policy research and civil society work. She serves on the international boards such as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and the Global Steering Committee of the Open Governance Partnership. Known for her advocacy in transparency and resource management, she has a leading voice in efforts to ensure responsible governance. Dr. J.C. Panungbayan is our second reactor. He is an assistant professor at the UP School of Economics and also adds his expertise in macroeconomics and Philippine economic history. 10 Outstanding Young Men awardee for economics in 2024. Dr. Panungbayan is also a columnist for Rappler and the author of the book False Nostalgia, The Marcos Golden Age Myths and How to Debunk Them. His background in institutions like the World Bank and the National Economic and Development Authority underscores his commitment to economic reform and public education. He is also a member of the board of the International Center for Innovation, Transformation, and Excellence in Governance. Finally, Dr. Kenneth Hartigan-Go, a senior research fellow with the Health Governance Program at the Ateneo Policy Center, Ateneo School of Government, and co-program director of the Health Governance Doctors to the Barrios Stack of the Masters in Public Management program of the school, brings a wealth of experience in health policy. Having served as Undersecretary of Health and Director General of the Food and Drug Administration, Dr. Hartigan-Go is deeply engaged in health governance. He is also a commissioner of the Lancet Commission City Without AIDS initiative, which seeks to prevent mosquito-borne diseases through innovative city planning and management. Each of these experts bring a unique lens to the critical issue of health and governance, as we will be discussing today. And we hope that this discussion promises a thought-provoking review of systematic reforms and transparency in government.
May we request Ms. Susara to provide us with her remarks, please. Let me step out first. Will you be able to?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Dean Randy. Thank you to the Ateneo community and the Ongpin family for inviting me to do this lecture this year. I'm actually very glad that I have this opportunity to talk about broader issues in public financial management in the Philippines. I feel that discussions, the coverage in the media focuses narrowly just on the issue of PhilHealth, when in fact, the issue of PhilHealth is just a single symptom of more serious public financial management issues in the Philippines. So again, good morning, and good morning to everyone who's tuned in the live stream, everyone from the Ateneo community, friends, and other guests in this hall this morning. So, okay, there. I'll be maybe taking 30 minutes or so to discuss a really complex issue. So the title of my presentation, of course, is PhilHealth's Cash Sweep, a glimpse into larger problems. Next slide, please. Outline. Tapos na. Backup slide lang yun. Okay, so my presentation this morning has 3 parts. First is, we all know the issue of the PhilHealth's cash sweep. So I will actually just use that as a springboard to discuss the 2 other sections. So that's our introduction. And then we'll go to the unprogrammed appropriations and why we're saying, Shelo, JC, and I, and many other health reform advocates are calling this problematic. And lastly, I will discuss the erosion of fiscal discipline under the current government. Okay, so when the 2024 budget was passed in December of 2023, last year, and I saw a new provision under the unprogrammed appropriations, I immediately posted on social media and said that 2 of the GOCCs that could immediately be affected by the cash sweep was PhilHealth and the NHA. At that time, there was no DOF circular yet. There was no news coverage about it, but my colleagues and I, used to be part of our think tank, ILEAD, already saw that provision. Like about half a year passed, and then finally it was out in the news that the DOF, the Treasury in particular, sweep the cash of PhilHealth and the PDIC. So how did that happen? The whole story of the PhilHealth's cash sweep and other GOCC funds cash sweep actually begins with the 2024 bicameral conference committee deliberations on the 2024 national budget. It happened on the last stretch of budget legislation when they were finalizing the 2024 national budget. It was a closed door session. As you know, there's lack of transparency in that process. And they reallocated so many things in the budget, from what we call the programmed appropriations, or the portion of the budget that has guaranteed cash cover, to the unprogrammed appropriations, or that portion of the national budget that doesn't have guaranteed cash cover. And they inserted an additional provision that didn't used to be there. Historically was never part of the provision, the special provision on the funds that can be tapped to trigger releases from the unprogrammed appropriations. And what is that? That special provision number 1, item D, which basically says unused GOCC funds can be used, DOF can tap it to finance the unprogrammed appropriations. In the past, it was difficult to use the unprogrammed appropriations because unless you meet certain conditions, that's 1, the government generates new revenues or excess revenues, or during the pandemic, they added foreign loans. But long story short, the provision on the use of the unprogrammed appropriations is similar to the constitutional provision on passing supplemental appropriations. So actually, the unprogrammed appropriations are just supplemental appropriations that's legislated as part of the national budget every year. Okay. That same provision said that DOF is supposed to issue guidelines in order to implement the cash sweep. Remember, this covers not only PhilHealth. It says all the GOCC's unused funds. So then, a few months later, DOF issued Memorandum Circular number 003 to 2024, where they outlined the specific provisions on operationalizing the cash sweep. So the computations are there, how they will arrive at determining what is excess funds of every single GOCC. Again, not just PhilHealth is there. And then immediately after that, PhilHealth returned 30 billion to the Treasury. Along with that, and there was never any noise about this, the funds that was taken from PDIC. So it's not just PhilHealth. Okay, so what's the fiscal implication? That's it. Unused GOCC funds will be reverted to the Treasury in order to finance programs and projects that are under the unprogrammed appropriations. I will talk about the unprogrammed appropriations later and what specific programs and projects were placed there by the BICAM. Next slide, please. Okay, the first narrative that fiscal managers said about PhilHealth's cash sweep when they took the 20 billion was that they needed this to pay for the COVID-19 health benefits of healthcare workers, which has been there for the past 3 fiscal years. DOH would propose it as part of their budget under the programmed appropriations. Congress would always slash it and place it under the unprogrammed appropriations. Again, the UA is that part of the budget that doesn't have guaranteed cash cover. So for 3 years, COVID-19 workers were actually waiting for their benefits. And they were essentially making 2 health priorities compete with each other. So they then got the 10 billion again. This time they said it was to finance the government's counterpart for the many loan projects that were placed under the unprogrammed appropriations. Immediately, my reaction, and Sec Butch, my mentor, also Shelo and JC, didn't make sense. You don't put priority programs, big ticket programs in that part of the budget that doesn't have guaranteed cash cover. But that's what Congress did. And it tied the hands of the economic managers to implement it as such. 30 billion, they said that's for the foreign-assisted project, the government counterpart for those projects. And then again, 30 billion pesos, again, for those things until cases were filed in the Supreme Court. And finally, the Supreme Court issued a temporary restraining order on the transfer of the final tranche, which is 30 billion pesos. Next slide. So PhilHealth already lost 60 billion pesos. And what they're saying is it's excess funds because they're not used. But many people, many health reform advocates say PhilHealth should actually be doing more. For one, it could increase the benefit package. Second, it could pay the reimbursements, which has long been unpaid since the pandemic. they could reform their own system. So it's really a problem of inefficiency, and it's dumbfounding that the solution to those inefficiencies and absorptive capacity problems of PhilHealth is to take out the cash instead of reforming PhilHealth and putting in place better systems. Like, I think they have a very inefficient actuarial unit that needs to be boosted. So why not use whatever's not used in order to finance PhilHealth? Because anyway, that's in the syntax law, that's in the universal healthcare law. And so that's why the cases filed in the Supreme Court cites those violations. But actually, the 60 billion is not the first time PhilHealth lost subsidies. Prior to the cash sweep, PhilHealth's allocation, the mandated subsidy of PhilHealth under the 2024 General Appropriations Act, was already cut. So it's actually a double whammy for PhilHealth. So the executive branch proposed 101 billion pesos total subsidies of PhilHealth. And the computation of that, of course, is based on the syntax law. After the BICAM, it was slashed down to 61 billion pesos. That's 40 billion pesos. So just at this point, 60 billion sweep after it was provided to them in previous years, 40 billion cut in the budget. So that's 100 billion cut from PhilHealth. Doesn't end there. PhilHealth subsidy could be further slashed in the 2025 national budget. So following the TRO, some senators said they are inclined not to give additional subsidies to PhilHealth even after the 60 billion cash sweep, even after the 40 billion slashed in the 2024 General Appropriations Act. So the proposal of the executive branch is 74 billion pesos. That's a lot lower than what was proposed in the 2024 budget. So they said it's currently at 69 billion pesos. We don't know yet how much will actually be slashed until the end of budget legislation. But as it stands in the General Appropriations Bill, it was cut by about 15 billion pesos. Next slide. So what are the red flags? We've already talked about possible violations of the Universal Healthcare Act, violation of the syntax law, which I think the 2024 and 2025 national budget might be violative of. The question we should ask here is how much really was the total syntax collection? If the syntax law mandates a certain percentage to go to PhilHealth for the National Health Insurance Program as the cover, the cash cover, the appropriations and the cash cover for indirect contributors, does that 40 billion cut in the 2024 budget mean it's getting less than what's mandated under the law? Same thing with the 2025 budget. Does it violate the syntax law? We cannot really answer that until the DOF, particularly the Treasury and the BIR, releases information as to how much is the total syntax collection. And we can compute from there how much PhilHealth should really get under those two budgets. It's never been done before. Ever since the syntax law was passed, whatever was proposed by the executive branch, because that level is based on the computation of both the DBM and the Treasury. That's what gets into the national budget. 2024 was the first time it was cut. 2025 might be the second time it's cut after all the 60 billion cash sweep on top of that. There's also a possible issue on the constitutionality of special provision number 1 of the UA, of the unprogrammed appropriations, and the DOF circular, which provides the guidelines for how to go about the cash sweep of the funds of PhilHealth and the GOCCs, and also maybe a possible violation as well of the prohibition under the Constitution on increasing the total budget. We'll talk about why the total budget increased in the next few slides. Okay. So the second narrative that came out after the first tranche was swept by the Treasury was that the PhilHealth funds will be used to finance the projects that are under the unprogrammed appropriations. So as I said a while ago, the unprogrammed appropriations, the yellow slice that you see here, that's equivalent to almost 5% of the national budget. These are just standby appropriations cover. Government essentially cannot award contracts if it's not part of the national budget. So it has to have an appropriations cover. The problem is, unlike this teal portion of the budget, which is guaranteed cash cover, and this is what's part of the fiscal program, this one doesn't, the orange one doesn't have guaranteed cash cover. As I explained a while ago, you'll need new revenues, excess revenues, or foreign loans in order to finance that. But since we're not expecting any new revenues or excess revenues, I think Shelo can talk more about the revenue measures. The recourse was to include the GOCC funds. It will allow them to finance the deprioritized projects under the unprogrammed appropriations without increasing the deficit. Because if they finance it without tapping the GOCC funds, there is a huge possibility that the deficit will go higher than projected. So this is the reason why they are targeting GOCC funds. One of the consequences of moving priority programs and projects from the programmed appropriations into the unprogrammed appropriations is that it increased the total budget level for 2024. It is actually part of a pattern. It's been done in 2022, been done in 2023. They're doing it, they did it in 2025. We don't know if they're going to do it again in 2025. So the total budget that was proposed by the executive branch for the 2024 national budget is 5.8 trillion pesos. Congress legislated 6.2 trillion pesos. So that's 450 billion pesos higher than the proposed budget. Again, there is a constitutional prohibition that what the executive branch proposes would also be the level that's enacted. This has been going on for the past 3 years. And the reason for that is accommodation of pork. So what they do is they put all the pork projects in the program appropriations, carve out that space from the program budgets of different agencies, put the priority projects in the unprogrammed appropriations, the budget increases. So essentially, we do not have guaranteed finance sources for the priority programs and projects, including the big ticket projects that the President mentioned in his own SONA, including the list of flagship projects that's released by the economic managers. They are all in the unprogrammed appropriations, and those are the loan counterpart. Those are the loan proceeds from various donor institutions. The government counterparts also there. The payment for right-of-way is also there. What project can be implemented if the payment of right-of-way is in the portion of the budget that doesn't have guaranteed cash cover? So the economic managers are not being transparent about the increases in the appropriations every time they present to the DBCC before Congress in both houses. They just say what was proposed was also the same level that was enacted. And this is consistent. I've been monitoring the budget since I left DBM, and this is the first time I saw this huge increase. Imagine almost half a trillion pesos. If they don't take away the unused, the underspent funds of GOCCs, the deficit will definitely go up. Okay, so just a quick recap of the sources of financing for the unprogrammed appropriation. So pre-pandemic, that's just excess revenues and new revenues. And then during the pandemic, added foreign loans because of the requirements for emergency response, like the procurement of vaccines, things like that. That stayed in the post-pandemic GAAs, and they added funds of GOCCs. In fact, there was a bill filed in the lower house that sought to amend the 2023 General Appropriations Act. This is the first time they attempted to include unused funds of GOCCs, but that bill didn't pass. So what they did was they included it as a rider provision in the unprogrammed appropriations of the 2024 national budget. The unprogrammed appropriations, the bloated unprogrammed appropriations, has actually been bloating the total budget itself. If you look at the graph here from 2010 up to 2021, there's no change in the level of the unprogrammed appropriations that's proposed and enacted by Congress. The only time it started happening was in 2022. So in 2022, the total budget was 100 billion pesos higher because of the unprogrammed appropriations. 2023 budget is 219 billion pesos higher. The 2024 budget is 450 billion pesos higher. You add them all up, that's almost 1 trillion. So they actually need 1 trillion from the GOCCs. If you think about it, over the years, that's how much they need. And that's, in fact, a symptom of what they're doing with the budget. So there's also another provision that's, I don't think it's never been discussed. DOF Secretary Ralph Recto claims that the unprogrammed appropriations can only be used for the priority programs and projects. That is false, because the same special provision says the President can modify that. If he chooses not to finance the priority project and finance something else because there's an appropriations cover, or simply put, a line item that will allow him to fund just about anything, he can do that. This is what they're not being transparent about. They keep saying it's to finance the priority programs and projects, the big ticket projects, the loan proceeds, the government counterpart. There is that provision in the special provision of the unprogrammed appropriations that says the President can basically override the prioritization. Never mind if the prioritization was actually listed down. The order of priority was listed down in that same provision. So we have a problem there. And my theory is that they did this in order to skirt existing budget rules and regulations, such as those that pertain to use of savings and augmentation, as well as the DAP ruling, which imposes limits on what else the executive branch can fund during budget execution. All of these things point to one thing. It's the erosion of fiscal discipline in our public financial management system. It's all happening because of the BICAM. I couldn't say it's the entire Congress because, well, to be fair, they do the deliberations transparently. So the effort that's put in by legislators and the staff is also essentially set aside by the BICAM, who just meets chair to chair, no transparency, decides to reallocate almost 1 trillion pesos or 1/5 of the national budget. And no one knows about it until we see the enacted version, and we get like really surprised because suddenly they need to sweep the cash of PhilHealth and other GOCCs. One other thing that we should also ask about is what other GOCC funds were swept aside from PhilHealth. PhilHealth is in the news because it involves a huge amount of funds. But are there others aside from PhilHealth and PDIC? We do not know. I will not be discussing the 2025 budget immediately, but there's also some misrepresentation in how they presented the 2025 proposed budget to Congress. So they said the 2025 proposed budget is higher by 10% than the 2024 budget. But what they're comparing the 2025 proposed budget against is the proposed level, not the enacted level in 2024. So in reality, the 2025 national budget is only 2% higher than the 2025 national budget. So, and program, they did not include the 450 billion peso and program appropriations in the accounting. The program appropriations in the 2024 General Appropriations Act is 731. Sorry, there's a mistake here. There should be 6.2 trillion. In the proposed version, it's down to 159. So we don't know if that's going to go up by 100 billion, 200 billion, or 450 billion pesos again. The budget also has become a political instrument rather than a tool for development. Sound public financial management dictates that the budget should be a policy-based budget and a performance-based budget. That means you link the budget to the strategic priorities that are in a Philippine Development Plan. That also means you measure the spending, the absorptive capacity of agencies, not just look at the figures, but the actual performance indicators. How can you do that when 1/5 of the total national budget is changed overnight? What kind of targeting system can you put in place in a matter of 2 days, 3 days? I don't know how the national government agencies are doing it, but clearly there's also this contributes to underspending in government. So that's another issue that we can probably have a separate discussion on. That's not part of my presentation now. But how do we characterize the national budgets, the past 3 national budgets under the current administration? First, priority projects are deprioritized to accommodate pork. There is a proliferation of non-strategic, hyper-local infra projects and ayuda programs. Again, these are non-targeted. These are not tied to performance measures. This doesn't have any objective basis for implementation. For example, a geographic focus for flood control projects. It doesn't have that because these are all insertions that happen in the last few days of budget legislation. There's also a return to a regime of 2-year validity of appropriations due to insertions. And this is not good because 2-year validity of appropriations will slow down spending. And we're already seeing it. In the second quarter, government spending contribution to the GDP is, I think, only 10%. In the third quarter, it's only 5%. So the question we should really ask is, where's our taxpayers' money going? What is it financing? And again, as I said, there's lack of transparency in the BICAM deliberations. And so what we really have is a patronage-driven budget that exceeds the total fiscal space every year, but has no clear emphasis in supporting the administration's own strategic development agenda. If they can do it for the big-ticket projects that's listed in NEDA's flagship programs, they can do it to the smaller socio-economic projects. And in fact, they do. They placed portions of the allocation for free tuition law in the unprogrammed appropriations. For 3 years, they placed the COVID-19 benefits in the unprogrammed appropriations. Agriculture projects, they also placed in the unprogrammed appropriations. So what is the budget funding? The budget increases by, well, 10% if we believe what they say, but that's not actually the case. So where is that 10% increase going every year? This is in detail what happened during the BICAM. Not just last year, but since 2022. So DOTR has a huge level of appropriations or total budget because of the rail projects. Every year, the BICAM slashes it. The past 3 years, the total amount of funds slashed from the DOTR is 277 billion pesos. And these are the projects that they placed in the unprogrammed appropriations. The strategic and big-ticket projects. MRT Line 4 project, Davao Public Transport, North-South Commuter Railway, Cebu Bus Rapid, Metro Manila, Subway, PNR, South Long Haul, and 40 other things. So these are just examples of the big-ticket ones, but there's actually a list of 50 projects on average every year that they put there. When we were in DVM, ni Sec Butch, the program appropriations only had 5 line items. It's just to cover unforeseen. It's just a contingency reserve, essentially. What else is they prioritize? The special purpose funds. The special purpose funds, it's about 5 or 6 of them. These are lump sum funds that are meant to finance like the military arrears, AFP modernization program, the increase in salaries of civil servants, some development projects. At the very least, I say at the very least because I have no way of tracking everything in the GAA. But in the past 3 years, 507 billion pesos was slashed. And then all of those things that were slashed, portions of them went to the unprogrammed appropriations again. what happened now to the freed up fiscal space? Remember, those things that they slashed are in the programmed appropriations, that portion that has guaranteed cash cover. Much of them went to flood control, the local roads, bridges, and multipurposes, which we know are pork barrel projects of legislators. These are the hyper-local, non-strategic, small infrastructure projects. If taken together, they would still amount to 556 billion or 21% of the total budget of DPWH in 3 years. That's a flood control budget. And then 1.2 or 44% of the total budget of DPWH in the past 3 years, local roads, local bridges, multipurpose halls, you add them together, 60+% of the DPWH budget goes to these things. So you have really limited room for strategic development. And we're only talking about infra. We're not even looking at education, not looking at agriculture, all of the other major agencies whose budgets are now slashed every year because they cannot spend. The same justification they're using to sweep the cash of PhilHealth. So the total budget of the DPWH in the past 3 years is 2.7 trillion. So 21% of that 2.7 trillion, flood control. 44%, the pork barrel projects. Plus, on top of that, 43 billion pesos worth of farm-to-market roads under the DA budget. And this is just the minimum. There's no way for us to tell exactly how much the magnitude of pork is. These are just the things that can easily be tracked because, well, as someone who's worked in DBM, I'm familiar with those line items. But we do not know if there are insertions in the budget of NIA. We do not know if there are insertions in the NHA, other GOCCs, other departments. We do not know that. On top of the flood control and the local info projects, a huge portion of the fiscal space has been allocated to ayuda programs. 138 billion in 3 years under the DSWD budget for soft projects. That's the assistance to individuals in crisis situations. And the new one, ayuda, what's this? Kapos ang kita program. AKAP. How much is that? DOH, the guarantee letters, 112 billion in 3 years. That's a medical assistance to indigent patients. Do they really want to fund the guarantee letters over capacitating PhilHealth, over fixing other programs of the DOH? In 2024, the allocation for the guarantee letters for the medical assistance to indigent patients program is 58 billion pesos. So that's equivalent to what they sweep from PhilHealth. Speaks to you about the real priority of Congress. Dole, you have the TUPAD program, tulong panghanapbuhay sa ating disadvantaged displaced workers, 77 billion in 3 years. And aside from that, the OP also has confidential and intelligence funds. And there's also a huge increase in the MOOE, or maintenance and other operating expenses of the lower house. In 2022, the proposal from the executive branch is always 10 billion every year. In 2022, they added 4 billion. 2023, they added 15 billion. In 2024, they added 8 billion. If you total that, that's 47 billion in 3 years. Budgeting is a zero-sum game. So when you take away something and add it to something else, you can easily track it in the GAA. So they freed up about 708 billion pesos of the fiscal space from the DOTR projects and the special purpose funds. Doesn't include the many other cuts in the regular budgets of major departments. They went to at least 730 billion pesos worth of pork projects. 573 billion infra or hard projects, 157 billion soft projects. And this is only halfway through the administration. This doesn't include the 2025 proposal yet. So you already see here a pattern of prioritizing pork projects. If we look at that in proportion to the programmed appropriations, legislators' projects amount to almost 20% of the budget. The budget increases, as they said, 10% a year. So that means that 20% goes to that, and another 10% comes from other things within the national budget. So I think this will go on until perhaps there's finally some transparency in the BICAM process. By the way, 20% is almost equivalent to the NTA, the National Tax Allotment, or the ERA. So that means ERA plus the legislators' projects, that's about 40% of the fiscal space already. So if part of the budget goes to the NTA and the hyper-local projects on top of them, despite the Mandanas ruling and the initiative to fully decentralize, what's going to be left for the national government agencies who carry the mandate of implementing and executing what's in the Philippine Development Plan? Around 1/5 of the budget is salaries. So we're only left with 20% for the national government agencies. Well, as I already mentioned, the increases in the appropriations are not part of the original fiscal program. This is the original fiscal, next slide please. The original medium-term fiscal program. The disbursement levels here correspond to how much the total fiscal space of the budget will be. So 5.3 in 2023, even if the proposal was 5.1, but the actual spending was 5.3, 5.7 for 2024, 6.2 for 2025, and so on and so forth. But as I showed in my previous slides, the legislated budgets are higher than this. So since I do not want to increase the deficit, there's no other choice for them but to sweep the cash off the GOCCs. And why are they doing that? Because of pork. Because they accommodated pork in the program budgets. And so now they have to find a way to finance the real priorities that would benefit the tax-paying public. The human capital development projects, the agriculture projects, the big-ticket railway projects. They need to find other sources for that. Maybe Shelo can talk about the revenue measures later. So, in a nutshell, public financial management guardrails are dismantled to accommodate political interests. So, on the expenditure side, the total budget has been breaching proposed ceilings despite the constitutional prohibition. On the finance side, government financial institutions' funds are toyed with in order to finance a budget that is not people-centered. Maharlika was the first salvo, BSP, Land Bank, DBP. And then for the unprogrammed appropriations for the past 2 years, PhilHealth, PDIC, and all other GOCCs. Funds are in peril. So, I'm down to my last few slides. I know it's depressing. Budget transparency remains institutionalized. Our score in the recent open budget survey is 75 out of 100, but there is less and less budget integrity under this administration. And so, finally, who does the budget really favor? It's the president and the politicians. The loans and the borrowings finance the bloated and discretionary UA, the higher MOOE of Congress, the OP's confidential and intelligence funds, the 60+% of local projects of the DPWH budget, and the AYUDA projects. The loans, the revenues, and the borrowings are not enough to finance everything. Well, to begin with, we have a budget deficit. But if you keep accommodating pork, that's equivalent to 20% of the national budget, you have to find other sources from somewhere. And their choice was not to impose new tax measures, but to take out the funds of the GOCCs who are supposed to have reserved funds under their own specific charters. So let me end with that with that slide. I see no one is smiling. I think you will be sadder when JC, Shelo, and Dr. Kenneth Artigan delivers their reactions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Zara. May we request our distinguished panel to perhaps occupy the table up front? We will try to have an open forum after the interventions or the initial discussions of our 3 distinguished guests. So perhaps my one request is that we try to keep the initial interventions to 10 minutes. So perhaps we can begin with Dr. Shelo Magno, and followed by Dr. Punombayan, and then by Dr. Hartigan Go. Ma'am?
All right, thank you so much. First, maybe my reaction is not to limit the blame to the bicameral and Congress, because if we limit the blame to them, we assume that the president and the executive branch is incompetent, right? Because in the first place, the president can line veto the budget, and the assumptions that after Congress passes the GAA, the executive branch reviews. And when Congress puts your priority projects under unfunded appropriation, that's a major red flag. So it simply means that whatever is happening in the budget has the blessing of the president. That's one. The second part of my reactions on the revenue side, because if you're looking at fiscal consolidation, it's not just about the spending, but also generating revenues. And early on, when Secretary Recto took over the Department of Finance, he already said that there will be no new taxes. What he's forgetting is that taxes is not just about revenue generation, but it also shapes behavior. So if we're gonna raise revenues, we can look at the sin taxes, because based on WHO recommendations, if we want taxes to be effective, for example, for sin products, the tax burden has to be 70% of the cost. And therefore, based on that, SIN products now require some adjustments in terms of tax rates. But obviously, if we're looking at political behavior and political interests, it's not in the interest of the President and Secretary Recto to adjust the taxes of tobacco and alcohol and other SIN products. What are the other economic measures that the government is prioritizing? Well, we just had Create More, which from the government perspective is the economic flagship program, which means giving more incentives to companies. And you know, in the literature, when you're attracting investment, it's not just about providing incentives anymore, because what we want to try to avoid is the race to the bottom between countries. No? But what is Create More? It's an amendment of this one-year-old law that was adopted during the time of Duterte, and it's actually one of the better laws that were adopted. What is the purpose of Create Law? It rationalizes the awards of incentives, and it makes awarding of incentives more transparent. What did this Create More, the version of BBM, did? Well, instead of having greater transparency in terms of awarding incentives to companies, they weakened the process of accountability. What do I mean by that? In the creation of this Create Law, you have the Fiscal Incentives Review Board, which I was chairing, the technical committee. And the assumption is that you don't just give incentives to companies. You have to review what kind of companies, which investments require incentives, and you monitor whether the incentives that you're giving to these companies are providing returns to the country in terms of capital, employment creation. That was weakened. And now the provision of incentives were returned to economic zones, so they can unilaterally give incentives again. The reason why the Duterte administration pursued this reform is because there's significant amount of leakages and corruption happening in terms of awarding incentives. So in effect, that reform was replaced, and we're back to where we are before Create. And that is expected to result in significant erosion of revenue. So there's no new revenue generation, but there will be revenue erosion. The other priority economic program of the administration in terms of taxation is the Mining Act. I'm sorry, I keep on talking about mining, but this is one of my, well, it's a good example, again, of the government priority. If we're talking of raising revenue, it goes against the principles that we should be advocating. No? So for example, in the mining sector, based on my estimate, effective tax rate is only at around 30%. Globally, countries with natural capital like minerals are taking advantage of the increasing price and the increasing demand due to climate change. For example, Peru and Chile, top mining countries, are now increasing their effective tax rate to at the level of 50%. But what this administration is doing, the version that passed the House of Representatives, instead of increasing a tax, lowered the royalty of companies from 5% to, initially the proposal was 3%. The version that passed the House of Representatives is 4%. So this again will result in revenue erosion. There are proposals to impose new royalties on mining outside mineral reservations. But the thing is, what you're not talking about is that under Create More, they reduced corporate income tax to 20% for priority industries. And mining is included in the priority industries. So even with the meager additional tax royalty for non-mineral reservations, with the reduction of corporate income tax to 20%, again, that's revenue erosion. So if there are no new revenues and priority programs would result in erosion of government revenues, then we would expect bigger deficit in the coming years. So you begin to question, so what really is the strategy, right? Well, the other part of the equation is growing the economy. And how do you grow the economy? Clearly, the policy that I mentioned is based on granting incentives. But as I said, if you comprehensively analyze the different policies needed to grow the economy, you have to look at human capital, you have to look at infrastructure investment to make sure that the country is competitive. But if you look at infrastructure priorities, as Saiza discussed, the big ticket programs of the government are now deprioritized and under the unprogrammed portion. Talking of human capital, well, PhilHealth is a clear example of how this government is treating investment in human capital. If we're serious about making sure that that healthcare is accessible for all, then what we should be doing is strengthening PhilHealth. But what is happening, if you look at the pattern of spending and budget allocation in the budget, is that there's a deprioritization of strengthening institutions that provide services to communities like PhilHealth, and strengthening social protection programs that encourage patronage politics. So for example, the ACA program is an insertion in the 2024 budget. That's a 26.4 billion insertion with no clear parameters on how to implement. This is the funding that's now being used by Speaker Romualdez, the money that he's distributing in his mall tour. No? And last night, I discovered that this same social protection program is being raffled in Cavite. So you join the raffle, you get 9,000, 10,000 ayuda. So when you talk of, well, social protection, right? When you design social protection, targeting is very important. You identify the risk exposure of the sector that you're going to provide ayuda for. You have to define the outcomes and the changes that you're expecting to happen. But clearly, in this social protection programs of the Marcos administration, wala yon lahat. This is just money dole out being distributed by politicians. So that's your infrastructure program, that's your human capital investment, this is your revenue, this is your economic strategic development plan, race to the bottom, more incentives. So just again, to reiterate, a reaction to SAISA, this is not just Congress, this is the BBM administration. Thank you.
So hello, good morning everyone. So I brought with me a few slides, just a few. Zai and Shelo and I are close collaborators and co-conspirators in many advocacies. So I will just endeavor to supplement what has already been said by them. Can we have the few slides, please? Okay, so history repeats itself and pulls us back once more. Next slide. So I'll dispense with the summary. I think we all recall what Saisa just said. Next slide. My first point is to just say that the cash sweep of PhilHealth is part and parcel of an emerging trend of the Marcos administration compromising the financial health of government financial institutions and government corporations. And if you go to the next slide, as Zaiza mentioned, the first would be the Maharlika Investment Fund. As you will recall, the Marcos administration passed this law approving the pseudo-sovereign wealth fund. You create a sovereign wealth fund when you have excess funds. But the Philippines, as has been discussed, doesn't have any surplus funds. So where did they get the money? They got money from the state-owned banks, specifically the Philippine National Bank as well as the Land Bank of the Philippines for the seed capital of the Maharlika Investment Fund. Specifically, they got, it's in the law, by the way, it's 50 billion from PNB, 25 billion from DBP, and then also they committed the net profits of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. Initially, there was talk about getting funds from the international reserves of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, which is a no-no in modern central banking. But they satisfied themselves by just getting the net profits of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. So many economists have already talked about the Maharlika Investment Fund as a major red flag. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that there's already a historical precedent in getting the surplus funds of government financial institutions. I think one of the main problems here with the Maharlika Investment Fund is that it crowded out essentially the loanable funds that are supposed to be gotten by farmers, fisherfolk, and cooperatives, which is part of the mandate of DBP and Land Bank, which is to promote and further rural development in the Philippines. However, because they got capital from the state-owned banks and use that as a seed capital for the Maharlika Investment Fund, essentially that reduces the funds that can be obtained or borrowed by fisher folk, farmers, etc. Next slide. So many questions were posed when the Maharlika Investment Fund was being crafted in late 2022 until the first half of 2023. What is it for? Is it even a sovereign wealth fund? What is its value added, since, for example, the National Development Corporation already does what the Maharlika Investment Fund wishes to do? Is it aligned with the Philippine Development Plan? What are the expected returns? How will it affect the budget process if it will initiate projects by itself? Who will manage it? Is it well-timed, etc.? So all of these questions were not answered satisfactorily until the law was passed. And now, lawmakers are wondering, next slide please. So by the way, this is the cover of the discussion paper. Shello did not sign because she was still at the DOF at that time, but I'm sure she would have signed this. So Maharlika Investment Fund still beyond repair. I think it's a very, very powerful discussion paper in the sense that it's a collective voice of economists concerned with the Maharlika Investment Fund and what is it really for, because it's rather unprecedented and it's a major threat to the financial health of state-owned banks. Next slide. The thing is, until now, they haven't invested in anything. And one of the problems is that the organizational structure of Maharlika still hasn't been approved. And the head of the Maharlika Investment Corporation, Rafael Consing, was requesting 2.5 million in compensation per month for heading this Maharlika Investment Fund, which even by the standards of the BBM administration, they said, oops, that's too big. And that's speaking a lot if they don't want that to happen. Next slide. So very recently, there was discussion in the Senate. It's all press release. There's no concrete plans, no concrete investments. And yet, the state-owned banks have already remitted their share of the seed capital of the Maharlika Investment Fund at the expense of the beneficiaries of these loanable funds, farmers, fisherfolk, etc. So just like the cash sweep of PhilHealth, this is also a major red flag that I think is a part of an emerging trend of getting money from whatever surpluses there are from government corporations, government financial institutions, calling them surpluses, and then using that money. Next slide. So just to note as well that there's historical precedent. Of course, we all know what had happened during the Marcos dictatorship. The Philippine National Bank essentially became a personal piggy bank of Imelda, funding shopping sprees, parties, the education of Amy Marcos, etc., Bongbong Marcos. But the main point is that the behest loans, basically the dictator instructed government financial institutions like PNB and DBP to lend to the businesses of the cronies. And again, all of these, what's happening with PhilHealth, with the Maharlika Investment Fund, it all is all reminiscent of what had happened already during the Marcos dictatorship. Of course, we know that all of these behest loans led to the massive deterioration of portfolios of GFIs. Basically, a huge bulk of their assets were non-performing assets. Basically, people they lent to were not able to give back the money that they borrowed. And essentially, they pocketed lots of that. Secretary Jess Estanislao of Finance during the Cory administration noted that the non-performing assets of DBP amounted to at least 100 billion pesos when he took over. Next slide. And then, of course, the Central Bank of the Philippines itself fell victim to the Marcos dictatorship. There was, of course, the infamous window dressing of the international reserves, basically the depletion of dollars during the Marcos dictatorship, and that prolonged our negotiations with the IMF at the height of the economic and debt crisis. And economists have noted that by the end of the regime, the losses of the Central Bank of the Philippines amounted to at least 300 billion pesos. I think Ma'am Corina Bautista wrote a paper that kind of mentioned this. I think I cited you in my book. So that gives you an idea of just how much they played around with the money of government financial institutions. And then fast forward to the Marcos Jr. administration, that seems to be happening again. Next slide. The second point I want to make is that the systemic misallocation of public funds is a major threat to the country's long-term growth and development. Next slide. If you look at the economic performance of the Philippines in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we experienced the worst recession or economic downturn in ASEAN. So if you list down all 10 ASEAN countries, we are at the very bottom. And when you look at this graph, you notice the distinct decline of GDP in 2020. And then you can see that we're far from getting back to the pre-pandemic trend if you crunch the numbers. In fact, what's emerging is that the incomes that our country will be earning in the next couple of years will be permanently lower than what we would be earning if the pandemic had not happened. So this is a very serious situation, and knowing all of the budget shenanigans, the cash sweep of PhilHealth, and the other evidences for misallocation of public funds, it really breaks your heart that the politicians are doing all of these budget shenanigans when in fact we have a very dire crisis that needs or demands urgent attention. Next slide. And then just to list some of the issues, we don't need to discuss all of these in detail. Education, 90% learning poverty rate, 1/3 of children under 5 are stunted, the car-centric infrastructure, the costs of congestion, the upcoming depletion of Malampaya natural gas reserves, climate change, and then the need for fiscal consolidation. All of these should be the priorities. And yet, the Marcos Jr. administration, as has been discussed, is doing all of these budget shenanigans at the expense of our country's future growth and development. Next slide. So just two last points. Without good governance and good economic and fiscal management, we'll definitely lag behind in Asia again, just like what had happened decades before. Vietnam, for example, is already outpacing us in terms of growth and development, and it's sad that we seem to be lagging behind once more. And then I think another lesson, next slide, is that we need to learn from our history, because all of these was happening right now. There's historical precedent to all of these. And if we just know a bit more of our history, then maybe there's hope that we can prevent or kind of abate what's happening right now. Next slide. So just a quick segue to my book. While you're here, this is already in its 5th printing by Ateneo Press. So if you haven't got a copy yet, it's at the Loyola campus. Next slide. That's all. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here. If you don't mind, I'm going to focus my reaction to PhilHealth because it started all this discussion. I've always been told that the government should be afraid of 3 things, and this is pertaining to PhilHealth. No? What are the 3 things? First, that as an institution, that government institution is losing credibility, that nobody listens to us. The second thing is when they cannot deliver the promised basic services. And the third one, where PhilHealth should be very scared of, if people started saying, we don't want to pay premium anymore. But nobody's ever said that, because it's a law that everybody has to pay their contribution as part of solidarity. The hemorrhage of funds outside of PhilHealth was in fact the chief complaint that led to our understanding that something is very unwell. And all the, metaphorically, all the attending physicians of PhilHealth over the last 10 years have not done a very good job. So what are my 3 key messages? Number 1, PhilHealth is a very sick 29-year-old patient with a possible mental health disorder. And what is that mental health disorder? When it's convenient, I'm a government agency. When it's convenient, I'm a corporation. Make up your mind. Talk to yourself. No? Second one is there's a very serious autonomic dysfunction. Their ability to self-regulate and audit themselves is sorely missing. Third, and it's refractory to a cancer treatment. We don't even know where the cancer is and at what stage of the cancer, and all the intervention doesn't seem to be working. So they have only resorted to aesthetic cosmetic surgery. So why are these interventions not working? In the meantime, we sense there's a marital disturbance between PhilHealth and DOH. Okay. What is my second message? No? When you look at the macro, I have a slide, the only slide I have. Could you please? We do not have a shared value as a society. We have very poor health literacy. we don't understand that PhilHealth Universal Healthcare Law was created with the intention of solidarity. That means we are our brother's keeper. But everybody's looking at that money for his own health care. There is a failure of trust. Leadership style and practice appears ambiguous, and does PhilHealth as an institution even understanding what is their participation in the entire health value chain? It's very complicated. I guess they are not. Now, if you look at the, since we're also in the Ateneo Graduate School of Business, I'm going to borrow a framework, and this is called the McKinsey 7S. Just by looking at using this 7S framework, we can see that PhilHealth is a failure. Created out of a vision, it's not fulfilling its mission. Every step of the way, from shared value to skills, staffing, structure, system, style, and the absence of strategy, they have not fulfilled any element. And nobody has the Commission of Audit has never audited them this way. They've only audited financial transaction, but not the way they deliver basic services. My third message is this. Even if you, oh, sorry, before I go into that, have you noticed we have never held accountable the directors of the board of trustee of PhilHealth? They have been there. We don't even know who they are. Are they fit to govern? Now, there is the SEC, Insurance Commission, Banco Central, is imposing that the board of directors of this corporation do their fiduciary obligation, that they take care of the institution by asking the right question, put independent directors, do risk management, do audits, but we don't see that. Maybe they do, but we don't know. But we really don't see that happening. So who are the board of directors, and why are they never held accountable for the things that are happening? Okay. Now, my third comment is the return of any funds does not even guarantee a better PhilHealth. We really need to solve the PhilHealth systems and structure problem so that we can prevent a 2025 fiasco from happening again. But nobody wants to talk about the reforms in PhilHealth. So I'm going to share with you some of the things I like to propose. No, should we put PhilHealth in the ICU, intensive care? Because obviously there's something wrong, right? Or should we say do not resuscitate by giving an advance directive? Let it die a natural death, and then create a new infrastructure. Because given the same thing, we can be doing the same thing again and again and expect a different outcome and result. No, okay. Functionally, the PhilHealth also wear many hats. They have to make up their mind. Now, am I a collection agency, and am I doing collection effectively and efficiently? What I've heard is that it's not. Is it an investment unit, an investment arm of the government? Is it a regulator? It seems they regulate because they put in policies and framework and procedures. And is it a payer? Is it implementing programs of healthcare? And we know that they need the help of the private sector, but they don't know really how do you manage this private healthcare provider? Because I think the providers are influencing the way PhilHealth works. So there are externality. You can't blame PhilHealth for its lack of competency, capacity, but also there are a lot of external things happening here. Now, I remember the late Secretary Kwasi Romualdez, who said, the money for protecting Filipinos on healthcare against financial risk against financial risk should be used annually up to the point of bankruptcy. But we're always afraid that we'll go bankrupt, and therefore let's save the money. But in the meantime, human capital, the social services that are provided to patients are not there. Okay, the amount of money they give to patients in hospital. Being a clinician, I know this. We don't even know the formula. For people who've spent millions in healthcare, in hospitalization, they only get 17,000 peso after 1 month. And we can't contest, we don't know what's happening. But in the meantime, PhilHealth has been doing a lot of arbitrary disaccreditation because of minor things, and they never resolve it until years later. I'm glad that yesterday, the Court of Appeal, Supreme Court said this cannot be arbitrarily be undertaken by executives of PhilHealth without going through proper governance review. So there are externalities, no? Um, there are too many chefs in the kitchen, too many critics without skin in the game. The cost of healthcare is very high. All of us are going to get sick, and you're going to feel how expensive things are, because healthcare at the end of the day is inflationary. Now, I had hoped that the PhilHealth will be the body that will come in and negotiate. They've never negotiated. They just decided how much we will pay, but we really don't know what negotiation tool. Now, for instance, do you know that many of the private physicians actually charge money on top of what they receive from PhilHealth? And therefore, when you're sick, you have to pay out of pocket. Our country has never had any benchmark on how a physician will levy their professional fee. Is it based on complexity, years of service, number of days? That has never been discussed. So that is a missing element. So without that, I don't know how PhilHealth will be able to come up with any decent structure for payment of provider fees. And that means there's something inherently wrong with the way it's being governed. Okay. In other countries, they have a benchmark. You know what you're paying for certain services. But that's not the way we're operating. There's a combination of universal care, but we also have a fee for service. It's highly unregulated. And we know that 80% of the healthcare is provided by the private sector. But we also know that PhilHealth has not been paying on time, to the detriment of some of the smaller private hospitals who have to absorb the loss. And how can they survive? You can't run a business like that, right? So, and the concept of healthcare is all about business of earning money instead of social good. The quality of service is not even regulated well by the government. We talk about quality service, but we should really be talking about value for healthcare. But as I speak about value for healthcare, which is not being practiced, we have already been overtaken by a new paradigm. And I'm introducing the new paradigm called overcoming the barriers to coordinated, accountable care. It's a new system of ensuring that care is coordinated. And that's what is missing in our universal health care. I think somebody mentioned actuarial system calculation has to be transparent and made efficient. We need to have a system for negotiating pricing. And there's a current, do we even have a current functional database that's updated in the Philippine Health Insurance Corporation? At the end of the game, the ethos of health financing is really too medical specialist centric. Okay? By then it's too late because you have to pay more for health care to the exclusion of other health workers. We don't even pay PhilHealth money to nurses. But we have an existential crisis. Nurses are leaving and they're not being paid enough, right? So what we need to do is to transfer part of that funding for physicians to the nurses. And that would ensure at least the skilled ones and the competent ones stay and provide better service. Now, nowadays, you talk to the nurses, what's happening to the patient? I don't know. I'm in my computer in the nurse's station putting notes there. I don't even know what's happening to the patient. So things have deteriorated in the healthcare, no? And I hope that PhilHealth would realize it before they start paying decently. Okay, but we also know that PhilHealth up to now is still running pilots and sandbox because they're not sure on how, because we don't have a playbook for universal healthcare. The law was signed in February 2019 and it's been 5 years. No clear playbook on how we will get both private and public sector working together and create this network. If PhilHealth were to be run like a business enterprise, I think it will go bankrupt and it will not pass. It doesn't control out-of-pocket expenses, and to me, it's failed its mission. But we cannot solve the bigger problem without resolving PhilHealth, no? Which, by the way, is legislated to become a monopoly. It is a monopoly. There's no other institution like PhilHealth. And as Robert Klitgard has reminded us, corruption, the formula for corruption is C is equal to monopoly plus discretion minus accountability. And perhaps is this what we're observing right now? So really, PhilHealth needs a lot of reforms. No? So question is, who regulates the regulators? The proposal is maybe put it under receivership and supervision of Insurance Commission. Insurance Commission is looking at all the life plans, HMOs and all that, but except this monopoly, which is a government agency, is not under any supervision. I've gone over time, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much to everyone. We are running behind schedule, and if we were to abide strictly by it, we should be requesting Mrs. Ongpin to say her closing remarks now. But you know, I mean, it's a very interesting topic. So I hope, with your indulgence, we can allot a bit of time, say 15 to 20 minutes, for the more burning questions from our audience, if there are any. So I'd like to open the forum to any questions from the floor. Do you mind going to the microphone for recording purposes as well? So for all those who'd like to propose a question or a comment, may I just request that you provide your name, preferred affiliation, and then your question. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Corina Bautista. I'm a professor emeritus at the UP School of Economics. And I like very much the presentation of Zai and the comments. But I think there are two separate issues here. One is the unprogrammed appropriations of government, which really takes away money from what the government should be spending. And clearly it's underspending in health, in education, climate change adaptation. But I think Dr. Go pointed out a very important thing, which is that we cannot really solve the problems in health unless we do something about PhilHealth. One of the things that he mentioned but didn't really point to is the amount of out-of-pocket expenses of total health expenditures, which is about 50% of total health expenditures are out of pocket, which really prevents the poor from accessing healthcare to begin with. The other thing is that during Kwasi Romualdez's time, there was a health sector reform agenda where 70% of total health expenditures should be covered by both the national government and social health insurance, of which the social health insurance part, PhilHealth, was supposed to cover 30%. It's barely covering 15% today. So I think aside from the unprogrammed appropriations being funded out of PhilHealth funds, I think what Dr. Go mentioned about doing something about PhilHealth is really important. And so I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to point out the severity of the problem in our society with regards to health and all other kinds of things. And part of the unprogrammed appropriations now were allocations to DNR on climate change adaptation, which Zai did not mention, but that's really very important. So I would just like to emphasize this point that hasn't been brought out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman in the brown coat.
My name is Ka Ernie Ordonez. I'm the chairman of Alianza Agricultura. Before we proceed, I'd like to ask if we can extend this. In other words, it ends at 11:30, but can we extend it to 12? Because I'm sure
It was supposed to end at 11, actually, 11:05. But go ahead, sir.
No, so
just
I'd like
provide-
to ask this question. I would like to request that this be extended to 12. That's my question. Is that okay? I mean, there's so much wisdom in this room, so we'd like to have a high return on investment.
Would you be all right with the extension?
It's an unprogrammed.
It's an unprogrammed thing. Some may have to leave. Thank you in advance, but go ahead, sir, please.
Yeah, okay. I'd like to summarize what I thought I heard, okay? It's unprogrammed. What I'd like to say is this. People can leave before that, but those who can stay up to 12, and I'd like to proceed to 12. Having summarized that, I'd
But
like to
please,
make my
sir,
question.
leave,
May I make my
leave a
question?
bit of time for everyone else. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, okay, anyway, my wish is that we stay stay to 12. People can leave earlier. Okay, here's my question. I'm glad Butchabad is here. I like to direct this question to Zaiza. I was with President Ramos as the Secretary of Flagship Projects. Before that, I was Undersecretary. But 2/3 of my life was in the private sector. So my question is this. Department of Budget and Management, correct? I always hear about budget. I don't see any management. And I'd like to ask you this question. You know, this thing is so messy. But in the private sector, what we do is we get, you know, a person to really look at these things and have management supervision. DBM is purely Is it possible, you think, if we can get some innovative leader, is it possible, you think, that there be a group in the whole government to look at the management performance of each agency? Because NEDA just gives economic plans, right? I'm talking about, you know, there's Ateneo guy here. He said NEDA should be run by a businessman, not by an economist, right? Of course, with due respect. He was a head of Department of Economics at Ateneo. He said that once. And I'm like saying this, is it possible, you know, if we ever get a leader, to have a group, it's really DBM, to expand that so they do some management instead of pure budget, no? So that they will really look at each group, look at performance, et cetera, yeah, and not PMS, I mean, something like that. So that's my question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question, sir. Well, technically, yes, they should be doing it. But there's one huge problem in DBM. That's why the management function hasn't really been effective. Number one is there's really no staff to do the management part. When Sec Butch and I were in DBM, the units that are in charge of the management part, meaning projecting the salaries and positions, how much the fiscal implication would be, what the organizational reforms of each government agency should be rolled out, only had 8 people. Nonetheless, Sec Butch attempted to roll out the monitoring and evaluation reform program of DBM. We set up a bureau in DBM to do precisely the things that you're saying. That's why sometime in the middle of the Aquino administration, we institutionalized performance-based budgeting. The idea was to tie the budgets with specific performance indicators, outputs, outcomes that need to be monitored by both DBM and NEDA. The problem is that bureau has already been abolished, and NEDA doesn't have the staffing as well to do that. I think they're trying for some of the big ticket projects, at least for the ones that go through the NEDA board. That's a very big challenge, but it needs to be done, as well as the audit findings of COA. Institutionally, that's been our weakness, and I think that would require huge institutional reform that will, of course, require resources as well from the budget itself. So we need to set up the institutions that will run that kind of performance management, performance evaluation function. We have to staff it up. Can either be NEDA or DBM, but I think they should be working in coordination with each other, because ideally, whatever is the result of the performance evaluation should feed into budget preparation as well. And those are the inputs that we need to plan the budget well. But because we're institutionally weak in that respect, Congress just abuses that vacuum, and so they just, claw back the fiscal space into projects that are very hard to monitor, because in the first place, they don't have targets. They're not tied to performance indicators.
All right. Thank you, Mrs. Zara. Of course. Go ahead, sir.
You know, I think it's very critical for the president to be on top of, especially the budget. When I was secretary of DBM, half of my time literally was in the office of the president, because every time the president is department heads come to him, almost always the problem is about money. And every time that happens, he calls me to the palace and asks me to brief him about the situation in that particular department, and then he makes a decision. Now, every time that we craft a budget, once we have finished it, he makes sure that before the budget is discussed in Congress, we have a meeting with the heads of different parties, the speaker, the officers of Congress, and he tells them, these are the important things that I don't want to see lost in the budget. We have provided for pork for your people here, but don't touch the priorities of my administration. If you do that, Butch will stand up, to object. And if you still insist on doing that, I will veto. That was very clear. That was very clear. That's why I was surprised with this. Reviewing and approving a budget is very tedious. The first step is the economic managers, together with the governor of central bank, they set the parameters for the budget. And sometimes we meet, 2 or 3 times just to do that. And then next is you issue a budget call, and you have technical budget hearings. So the finance and budget bureaus of departments meet with their counterparts in DBM. And then we go through an executive budget review, which is the heads of my undersecretaries and myself. We review the budget and finalize it. And then we submit it to the cabinet. And then we debate there before it is submitted to Congress. So I'm surprised that I did not hear even a whimper when Congress moved 449 billion, and I think part of that is 224 billion loan proceeds from loan agreements into the unprogrammed fund. I mean, we did not hear anything from the Secretary of the Budget, nor did we hear anything from, because the National Expenditure Program is the President's budget. It's aligned with the their 8-point development agenda. It's aligned with the national priorities, and it's aligned with the medium-term budget framework. So this has gone through a lot of discussions, and then in one night, the discretionary part of the budget, practically all of it, is transferred to the unprogrammed fund. And I think by doing that, the government has put itself in a very serious, I think, unsolvable dilemma, because I don't think that they can transfer the money from the GOCCs to other programs and projects, because there is a provision in the Constitution, Article 6, Section 25(5), that says, no law shall be passed authorizing the transfer of appropriation. That's the general rule. So you cannot just transfer, because it's put in the Constitution because it affirms the importance of the independence of branches and check and balance system in government. The only exception there is when there are savings and you can augment existing but deficient items of appropriation. And I don't think that, for example, in the case of PhilHealth, that the 89.9 billion is savings. It cannot be savings, In fact, I think in 2022 they raised premiums by 45%. Last year they raised premiums by 25%. You can deal with the problem, but you're using that 89.9 billion. So if they cannot use the money that's supposed to come from the GOCCs, the only other source is new revenues or they exceed revenue collections, which I think is not possible. So now the question is, how can they fund, for example, 225 billion worth of loan proceeds, which are, of course, subject to loan agreements, if they don't have any source for it? So what is the government going to do with that? You know, so they've really put themselves in a very difficult position in this case.
Thank you very much, Secretary Abad. Any other intervention from the floor? Please.
Hi, I think it's afternoon already, or it's still the morning. Hi, good morning. I think I'm the only member of the media here. Hi, my name is Joey Marzan. I'm from Daily Guardian. It's a newspaper based in somewhere in Iloilo. Just wanted to ask, well, it's directed at Ms. Zaiza, but probably Sec Butch or you, Sec Shelo, can probably chime in. No? Actually was wondering about I wanted to know more about the GOCC earnings that were moved to the unprogrammed funds. Based on where they came from, what could they have been allocated for? Like, ano ba yung, to make it simple, ano ba yung missed opportunities para dun sa mga GOCCs to improve and carry out their services to the people?
The way insurance works kasi is, for example, if a budget is allocated, all the premium, the money that was given to PhilHealth was a premium for non-contributing members. These are earmarked funds from the excise tax. So kapag may mga member ng society who cannot pay their premium, ito yung premium nila. But once a premium is transferred to PhilHealth, you have the pooling system where you consolidate all the money. And that money is used to subsidize or pay for the health expenditure of all the members, paying and non-paying. So the problem is maybe there's this fund because PhilHealth forgot to expand the coverage when they've expanded the premium already. And therefore, yun yung presentation ni Dr. Go, that they're missing their responsibility of making sure we have universal health care. So, dun yun pumapasok. Kaya once the money enters the account of PhilHealth, you cannot distinguish anymore on whether this is government subsidy or this is premium because of the pooling mechanism.
Just to follow up on that, no, and anyone can actually answer this, because we have an example from our hometown where actually private hospitals grouped together threatening PhilHealth that they would leave. I think that's around 2021 or 2022. Could the money that PhilHealth is accumulating, that have been used to improve how they are going to pay the hospitals?
Yes.
PhilHealth's responsibility because the private hospitals are service providers and therefore they should be paid for the services that they've provided to PhilHealth members. But that's one of the inefficiencies that Dr. Go has identified. The rate of reimbursement and the way they administer and review the claims of hospitals. We've been asking for the data, but we've heard that there's significant inefficiency, and that's why a lot of private hospitals are now withdrawing their affiliation with PhilHealth, which is also going to be a problem because it's not enough that we have insurance coverage. If we don't have providers, then there's no supply of health services. So again, it adds to the health crisis.
There's not enough government centers to cover for that as well.
All right. Thank you very much. Perhaps at this point, we'll ask each discussant to provide their last interventions, 2 to 3 minutes. We'll start with Dr. Ken down to Mrs. Zara then.
I think we have to pay attention to PhilHealth, primarily because all of us will be affected. And I think it's a societal obligation to keep ourselves informed with what's happening and what are the procedures and system, and compel them to be more transparent. Because otherwise, the system will go on as is, and all of us will suffer.
Thank you, Dr. Kenneth.
On my part, I just want to say that there's a growing disconnect between the development and growth priorities that we should be focusing on and what they're actually doing. So yeah, I think it's a very important concern that I don't think enough people are looking into this. But yeah, if we don't fix things, we will be left behind in this region of the world.
To complement that, looking at the bigger picture, we really need to question what is going on and where are we going and what is really the economic and social development of this administration, because PhilHealth is just an example. If going back to what I presented, number one, who are benefiting from the incentives that the government is giving? Who are these interest groups that are getting exemptions from tax payments? And then you look at the government priorities, defunding infrastructure, but you have all these pork barrel programs, destroying institutions instead of strengthening them, but focusing on the ayuda. So now we're looking at a system, an economic government social system where you have oligarchs benefiting from incentives of governments, people being dependent on ayuda without clear economic direction on where we are going. And if we do not criticize, if we do not talk about it, then sa kangkungan po tayo pupulutin by the end of the BBM's administration.
Okay. My last few words. I think for me, we shouldn't be satisfied with just budget transparency. We have to demand budget accountability. Because what's in the medium-term fiscal framework? There are a bunch of numbers, and when economic managers talk about it, they say that they've kept to these numbers, they did not exceed the deficit, they disbursed the budget, whatever, things like that. That's not the point. The MTFF is only a means to an end. We should never lose sight of what the MTFF and the national budget is for. It's for the competitiveness of our country. If you see a budget that's misallocated, we should ask ourselves, where is our country really going?
Thank you very much. While this may be the end of our formal discussion, I would just like to remind everyone that we've prepared a few refreshments outside, and so please, once we have formally closed the program, feel free to continue the discussion in a more informal and casual setting. But at this point, thank you again to all our speakers. May I request Mrs. Maribel Ongpin to formally conclude our event.
Thank you, MS Susara, and our panel reactors, Ms. Magno, Dr. Punong Bayan, and Dr. Hartigan Go. It has been a revealing discussion, what's definitely a controversial move regarding taxpayers' money. The inefficiency and venality that we have seen and experienced in PhilHealth, an originally good and progressive idea that has gone terribly wrong, is a matter of grave concern. Public opinion has made its demands for rectification. I would like to add a few more comments that I decided on just this minute after hearing all of this. Number one, educators need education. Legislators need to be educated. They don't know what they're doing. Most of them, 200, I would say 90% don't know anything about fiscal management. They need to do that. Then there's no management expertise. What kind of agency is PhilHealth? It has no management expertise. It's very clear, and yet they're still there. Okay, then the Supreme Court better get conscientized about the Constitution. I'm sorry to say that, but having delayed this PhilHealth thing to January is almost criminal. Then the last thing, well, is that we have to stop whimpering and start shouting about what's going on. It's a time for more vigilance, more engagement, more demand on how to treat taxpayers' money for the common good, the progress of the nation, and the honesty that's obligatory and which seems to be missing. Let's demand justice and transparency with courage and persistence and more efficiency from the part of our government agencies. Thank you very much. Sorry, but I'm upset.
Thank you, Mrs. Ongpin, for the rousing call to action. Thank you, everyone, for spending your morning with us. And we would like to also take this moment to present tokens of appreciation to today's speakers. This book is one of the latest publications of the Ateneo de Manila University Press. I'm not particularly sure what book it is, if one can hope.
This is for you, Miss Susara. I hope this is for Dr. Shelo. Dr. Shelo, thank you. And Dr. Bayan, thank you. And Dr. Hart again, thank you so much. It has been a very revealing, and I hope this is call to action.
Flowers for Mrs. Ongpin from Father Bobby. We would also like to thank the following offices and units: the Ateneo School of Government, the Ateneo Law School, Campus Safety and Mobility Office, the Central Facilities Management Office, the University Marketing and Communications Office, the Arete Production Team, the Office of the Vice President for Digital Information and Technology Services, the Office of University Development and Alumni Affairs. Father Kit is here, of course. Once again, thank you for your enthusiastic participation, which we hope can continue outside. And for those who weren't able to join us, the recording of this lecture may be accessed on the YouTube channel of Ateneo. We hope to see you again next year for the next Jaime V. Ongpin Annual Memorial Lecture. So let's have a quick round of photos, perhaps, and then please, again, join us at the reception outside.